If they're familiar with the whole avatar phenomenon and being able to, as it were, reinvent themselves online, and here comes trans theory saying, well, the reason you're uncomfortable is because you're trans and you just need a new avatar, and this is the way to do it. Start taking testosterone or whatever. It's this perfect storm.
If gender is constructed, it can be deconstructed. Think about it. If we built it, then we can tear it down. And now you know why some activists have been so determined to convince us that gender is something we assign rather than something we receive. If we assign it, then we can reassign it as we wish. We don't receive our bodies, we can remake our bodies. No doubt you've observed the rise of transgender theory in Western culture. It's the denial that the sexed body reveals and determines the gender to self. That's the helpful summary we find in the excellent new book, The Body God Gives, a biblical response to transgender theory, written by Robert Smith. Smith is an ordained Anglican minister and lecturer in theology, ethics, and music ministry at Sydney Missionary and Bible College in Australia. He's written 2 previous books on gender and identity. This new book by Lexham, now Baker, gives you a little bit of everything. He breaks down the arguments of gender theorists. He guides readers on a who's who of philosophers who built the intellectual foundations of the secular West, from Descartes to Rousseau, Kant to Marx, Wittgenstein, Freud, Sartre, Derrida, Foucault. There you go, the whole crew. And he concludes with biblical argumentation to show us nobody is born in the wrong body. He writes, quote, God's desire for my gender is revealed by the design of my body. And I appreciate how Rob harmonizes the biblical story from Genesis to Revelation. Quote, our present task is to work with the grain of creation toward the goal of new creation. Rob joins me now on Gospel Bound to talk transgender theory, how it spread, why it's peaked, and where evangelicals need to go next. Rob, thank you for joining me on Gospel Bound.
It's great to be with you, Colin.
You have devoted an enormous amount of time to researching and writing about transgender theory. Why?
Well, it's a good question to start with, I think, because it was about 2014 when I was doing some work on human sexuality more broadly that I became aware of the significance of the transgender challenge and the questions that the phenomenon was raising, and just the emerging significance of the whole movement. So I think Time magazine in February 2014 had this cover story called "The Transgender Tipping Point," and I remember reading that article very early in my research, and so I became convinced fairly quickly that somebody needed to be working on this. And as far as I could see, there weren't many evangelicals who were putting their sort of hand to the plow. So I started gathering materials and making bibliographies and writing notes and thinking, now who do I give this to? Who do I pass all this preliminary research on to? And after a while, I became convinced that the Lord wanted me to keep going with it. And then simultaneously to that, within our wider family, we had these issues come to us in a very personal way, and so that brought the what you might say the intellectual and the pastoral together. Yeah. So this was no longer a theoretical exercise of just trying to wrestle with ideas, but became very much just a personal pastoral exercise of how do we love people. So that's been part of my journey as well, bringing together the transgender theory with what some would call transgender experience, and seeing how do we make sense of all that.
Now, you mentioned already that Time magazine cover story, the transgender tipping point. You identify that as the end of 2013. What was it that made that period of time that transgender tipping point in Western society?
Yeah, look, I think a number of things. Again, just the promotion of transgender celebrities, as that cover itself revealed, was part of it. There was also changes in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and so there were even diagnostic shifts and intellectual shifts. A range of social and intellectual factors came together. Gay marriage was, hadn't quite come in yet in the US or Australia even. But many of the gay activists, I think, were looking for the next, you might say the LGBT activists were looking for the next cause to promote and next, as some sort, civil rights victory to achieve. So, these things, I think, came together. And, of course, social media plays a huge part in this. As these identities begin to spread through different platforms, and YouTube influencers and other sources like that start to not only teach the ideas but model these changes.
Rob, to whom would you compare the influence on our culture of Judith Butler? And I'm wondering also, more influence from Butler than Foucault? How would you describe that?
Well, I think, many people have not even heard of Judith Butler, let alone read a word of her work, and her work's not easy to read.
But they can probably recite many things that she taught.
They can, even though her views have shifted and changed and evolved. And so I do think her influence has been profound. She is a classic example of the meme that ideas have consequences, because certainly the ideas that she was playing with back in the early 90s and promoting through her various writings have trickled through academia into education, and into schools, into children, into business, into government, into all kinds of institutions. So the fundamental idea that sex is, as she puts it, radically independent of gender, that idea has been a very, very powerful one and destructive one. In some ways she fired a torpedo, unlike anybody else. But again, she didn't come out of nowhere. She was building on the work of second-wave feminists who were themselves building on the work of existentialists, even going back to Nietzsche and others. And so, there are lots of antecedents for her work, and I've, at least in my research and writing, I've distinguished the kind of queer approach of Judith Butler with what I've called trans theory as opposed to queer theory. In that they do sort of part ways at certain key points, which I'm happy to go into if that's somewhere you want to go.
Well, let me first, before we come back to the difference between queer and trans theory, I did want to, what does Foucault come in here? And because again, it felt like as I'm going through the book, it seems that in one sense, you mentioned the antecedent, so there's always something underneath. It doesn't come out of nowhere. But in terms of two of the leading intellectual figures that, probably most of us don't know how to pronounce. If we saw Foucault written, we wouldn't know. And yet somehow a lot of what we think about the world is from those two people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Foucault, again, is often his name's often associated with postmodernism, although he himself didn't like that term. But he is a great disruptor. He is challenging traditional categories, traditional way of thinking. He is. He was quite brilliant, I think, as well as quite perverse. But anyone who's read any of Foucault's books realize you're dealing with a very a potent mind here. And certainly Butler is reading Foucault. There's no question about that. And she's reading Derrida, and she's reading all of these. She's very, very much across the philosophical tradition, and particularly the postmoderns, as we often clump them together. So we don't realize how much we are living in Foucault's world or Butler's world, but that's the fact of it. Now, again, his contributions are interesting and varied. in one sense, they don't go straight. There's no straight line from Foucault into trans theory, but I think you can trace the line through Butler. There's some general thoughts about that. But
well, so often we don't understand our culture because we can't experience what an earlier generation did. So we simply don't know what's different. We might hear something and we don't know if it's brand new or if people came up with it last week or if it was something that has always been there before.
Yeah.
We're just going to cut off, especially in the way that these very intellectual trends have produced that outcome of cutting us off from received and inherited wisdom and tradition. So I just think it's important in a book like yours to be able for people to identify, you know what, that thing that you just assumed to be the case actually came from this person with this lineage in this year. And these are the reasons why it doesn't really make sense even on its own terms, or there are inherent contradictions within the very system. So let's jump there then, Rob, to the inherent contradictions between queer theory and trans theory, which I don't imagine a lot of people would even know that those are different from each other.
No, I think often they get sort of mushed together because of the LGBTQ, and we assume that's a happy family, which of course it isn't at all. There's now even an LGB alliance that's kind of ganged up against the T. So again, in traditional sort of Aristotelian thought, your essence precedes your existence. So you have a given essence. Now, we as Christians would say, yes, from God. But of course, naturalists might say, well, we have a given essence from evolution or something else. But either way, we have a given essence, and our business is to live that out. And we, as it were, we flourish best when we live out our given essence. Now, the existentialists flip that around. Sartre's famous motto that existence precedes essence, that we just simply, to use Heidegger's language, are thrown into the world and exist. And as we, make our free decisions, we, as it were, craft an essence. Now, queer theory comes along and says, well, actually, you don't even ever get to creating an essence. All you are is an identity without an essence.
Yeah.
That's David Halperin's famous expression, identity, that sums up queer for him, identity without an essence. And so for Judith Butler, when she comes along and says, sex and gender are radically independent, and that if you ask her, well, what determines your gender then if it's not just sex, she would say, well, you perform a gender. You're an identity without an essence, so you inherit some different types of performances, but you might want to riff on those and play around with those. Gender is performative in that sense. Now, trans theory differs there and says, no, your gender is determined actually by your inner gender identity. That is in fact your essence. So trans theory in that sense is essentialist, as opposed to queer theory, and saying, no, you have an inner gender essence which only you know, and it may or may not happen to align with your body. And there's no reason why it should align with your body, hence care of queer theory. And if it doesn't align, you're transgender. If it does align, you're cisgender. But if it doesn't align and you want to bring your body into line with it, then feel free. Do that, make the bodily changes you think are necessary, and many would want people to, the public purse to pay for that in some way. But then you have, as I've sort of disambiguated in the book, I suppose, a development of what you might call traditional trans theory. I call it soft trans theory in the book. But the traditional trans theory effectively says, okay, your body has a sex, but your gender identity is the real you. Whereas the more radical form of trans theory says, no, your gender identity actually defines you completely. It reclassifies your body. So if my gender identity is female, then this body becomes a female body. I don't have to do anything at all to it. I don't have to even change my clothes, my hair, or my name, let alone have hormones or surgeries. I am now a woman in every sense, and I should be able to play on the female sports team, or if I commit a crime, I should go to a female prison. And so that's the more that I've called that hard trans theory, but I guess it's the more radical version. But both of those have a kind of inner gender essence at the heart, which is not there in queer theory. So that's one of the distinctions.
Just like you were describing the different philosophical origins, I think it's so important for people to understand the contradictions within that community, because the projection of power is the unity. But the only thing that's unified is a rejection of historic and biblical sexual norms. There's no unifying principle within. And in fact, not only is there no unifying principle within, they're often directly contrary to each other.
Yeah.
And in open warfare against each other. So even that basic point is, I don't think widely known, or when people see a pride flag and then they see then the trans parts are added in there, they don't really understand the significance of what's happened there, or what's changed, or the ongoing battles for control over a movement, its directions, its priorities, its funding, its strategies. And let's then look back to how this has begun to unravel. During the time you spent research and writing, Rob, it seems that we've passed peak transgender. Still widespread influence, no doubt, but that influence is on the decline. Why did it decline?
I mean, I think that's right. Time will tell, but to use the Second World War analogy, it's kind of like we're in between D-Day and V-Day or VE Day.
The beginning of the end, perhaps.
Yes, that's right. So the
beginning of the
end. Why did it decline? Well, I think we've seen some of it in the public arena because the whole thing is unworkable, practically speaking, and so we've had public sort of pushback against men taking all the prizes in women's sports, or male sex offenders being put in women's prison and surprise reoffending. It just doesn't work socially, even if somebody's got a nimble enough mind to somehow justify it to themselves intellectually. It just doesn't work on the ground. It doesn't work medically. It's just, yeah. So the thing is riddled with not just intellectual contradictions, but just unworkability. So that's partly, I think, why we're seeing that. I mean, again, there's been some court cases, and as I mentioned already, some of the at least the L's and the G's have been pushing back against the T, because now they talk about the whole T movement as a way of transing away the gay. So as they see it, they certainly see child and adolescent gender transitioning as a form of conversion therapy. And so there's a major war there between at least LG and T on that front.
Yeah. Do you still commonly hear people argue that it would just really work if everybody who disagreed changed their minds, or were even eliminated or removed from public discourse? Because part of what we talk about when we're saying unworkability is that mental health, suicide, all sorts of these really damaging outcomes, in addition to the hormone therapies and the treatments themselves, and the damage that they cause. But we're seeing these are not producing the outcomes that were always promised. This will bring happiness. This will bring fulfillment. This will bring wholeness to you. I've not seen any indication that that's actually happening. No surveys that have indicated that. In fact, it seems that the opposite is produced. Now, when we used to see that argument, it was, well, that's because society doesn't accept this.
Yep. Yeah.
Is that still trotted out and used against parents, used by schools, by counselors and others to pressure parents into this affirmation process?
Yes, occasionally. I mean, those responses haven't completely died off, as far as I'm aware. And likewise, the suicidality myth that if you don't allow your child to transition, they're going to take their own life. Again, that is just not borne out by the stats and the facts. In fact, quite to the contrary, it seems that people's mental health declines and their suicidality increases post-transition. So I think there's just more and more evidence coming out that is just sounding the alarm and exposing the lie of some of these things. And then you've of course had the big reports, the Cass report in the UK, and the Health and Human Services report in the US, and some of these systemic reviews that lie behind those that have really emboldened people in the medical world to really say what they've long thought, which is this is irresponsible, this is medical experiment, this is actually a medical scandal. So more and more doctors and therapists and others are now willing to speak up and risk their livelihoods as they become more and more convinced that this is a great source of harm. So I was at a conference just in Australia just a couple of weekends ago where there were again, medical people and all kinds of psychologists and psychotherapists and psychiatrists and some legal people, and not Christian by and large. I mean, many of them probably were, but the conference itself wasn't explicitly Christian, but these were just concerned professionals coming together saying we have to stop, at the very least, have to stop what's happening to children and adolescents.
Let me just take a step back, Rob, into a bigger question that one of those again that I don't think many people understand the background of, and that is, should we distinguish between sex and gender?
That's a very good question that I still wrestle with. Now, in the book, I argue that it's kind of a ship that's sailed, and so let's see if we can make it work. But there are people who have argued the ship should never have sailed, or that we ought to recall it to the port. So even the philosopher Alex Byrne, who's not a Christian as far as I'm aware, but in his book, what's it called now? It's here, The Trouble with Gender. He argues quite a strong case for just losing the language of gender altogether. And he has some good points. However, there obviously is a difference between having a particular type of body and then how we conceive of that body and how we present that body in the world. Now, as I say in the book, I think we could easily talk about biological sex, psychological sex, and social sex. That would kind of join everything together nicely. That you have a biological sex, and then you think about that in certain ways, and then you present that in certain ways, in the way you dress and the things you do in life, and the way you, even just the way you relate and hold yourself. So if I had control of the English language, which I clearly don't, that would be probably my preferred option.
Yeah.
But given that through the 50s and 60s, the language of gender, initially came to sort of apply to the social expression of sex and social roles and that kind of thing, but then also to the psychological conceptions of sex. We've ever since sort of been stuck with gender, but nobody's ever quite sure what it means. Is it just functioning as a synonym for sex, which sometimes, of course, it is on government forms and things, but then sometimes it isn't. Or is it referring more specifically to gender identity, the psychological, or is it referring to gender roles or expression, the social? And so, it just creates a bit of a world of confusion, and you've kind of got to interrogate anything you read and almost anyone you speak to, just to clarify in what sense are you using the word gender? So it's often people say, "Oh, my gender's male." Well, strictly speaking, in the current lingo, no, your sex is male. But of course, your gender is also male because your sex is male.
Right.
But then that begs the question: why do we need gender then if sex does the job?
No.
But again, I think the reality is, yes, there are different ways of presenting your sex. So we don't all dress the same way or wear our hair the same way, or there are different ways of being a man, different ways of being a woman that are not confusing, but they're just not the same. And so I found myself saying over recent months, sex is not a spectrum, and because gender is really the extension of sex, gender is not a spectrum. But masculinity is a spectrum, and femininity is a spectrum. There are literally billions of different ways of being a male on this planet, and likewise a female on this planet. And that, in a sense, that's part of created diversity. It's not a bug, but a feature.
Yeah. Well, that's if we collapsed everything within sex and we got rid of the concept of gender, it would seem that we would run also not just into a self-presentation problem that you're describing here and individuality, but also a cultural anthropological problem. Because it's not just that we feel differently and we express our femininity and masculinity in some, shared but also different ways, but also the expectations we have for men and women vary substantially from culture to culture and from subculture to subculture. So one of the overall challenges we face is to be able to affirm a biological essentialism. I mean, in the sense that you are male, you are female. You can see this from the organs that you have that are given to you by God. And at the same time, there's not only one way to be able to express that, but you can see why people do not want to stick with gender, because once you all of a sudden get into Butler and you get into gender theory and all these things, you realize, oh, it's actually a way of separating us from biological. It's a way to explain that everything's a construct, just like I opened the podcast with, everything's a construct. So you can see why the problem is there. But if we collapsed it back all into sex, into a biological essentialism without any expressive component, then I don't know how that would work practically. And it actually could have some pretty negative effects as well. And negative effects that we've seen, that we've had the familiarity with, of telling everybody that there's only one way to be able to be masculine or only one way to be feminine. And I think also for Christians, you run into a problem there because biblically there are some clear differentiations, but there's also so much substantial overlap that you risk running into a really bifurcated discipleship. Mm-hmm. Am I off track there?
No. I think that's exactly right. And one of the ironies is the whole trans movement trades on very, very rigid, narrow gender stereotypes.
Exactly.
So whereas, once upon a time we called a girl who just loved rough and tumble and climbing trees and that sort of thing, we just said, okay, she's a bit of a tomboy. Whereas now, of course, the diagnosis would be, oh, no, she's probably trans. Yeah. And likewise, a little boy doesn't turn every stick into a gun, but actually likes dance and beauty, and oh yes, he's trans. So yeah, that's a tragedy, and it also can play out in the church, of course. Now again, I think every culture, including church cultures, inevitably develop gender stereotypes, or at least gender types. A friend of mine has made a helpful distinction between types and stereotypes.
Yeah.
He illustrates this by saying, when we go to a black tie wedding or something, we go right. Everybody goes straight into full-on stereotype mode. Men in tuxedos, women in cocktail dresses or whatever. But then when we come home, we revert to types rather than stereotypes in a much broader, looser way. But where our types get too tight and start to become stereotyped, that's when we start to send messages to people in our churches that there's something wrong with them, just because they're not in the center of that spectrum we call masculinity. They're more towards the fringes. They're not outside the bounds, but they're just not right in smack in the middle. And if all we ever have is, barbecue meat nights for men and craft events for women, if that's all we ever have, it does send a message that if you're not a man who's into meat, there's something wrong with you, or not a woman who's into craft, there's something wrong with you. And again, that's where trans ideas come in and say to people, well, what's wrong with you is that you're trans.
I want to just pinpoint something. I meant to bring it up earlier, but it's relevant here on the question of what you do with children. And when children are, well, I don't seem to be like the other boys, or I don't seem to be like the other girls. And we've always handled that a certain way in the past. And we've recognized, especially in puberty, a lot of those things change. Personalities change, attitudes change, presentation changes as the body changes. So we've seen that generally work out there. But when I was talking to Ross Douthat of the New York Times, and I've mentioned this on this podcast before, but it's always relevant, I couldn't understand why the Cass report in the UK didn't get the kind of traction in the United States that it did in the UK. And I can't speak to Australia in the same way, so perhaps you can. But he pointed out something that should have been obvious to me, which was in the UK, the government's paying for these treatments. So they want to know whether they're valid. In the United States, it's a free market, so you're paying out of pocket. So if you can convince the parents that their child is going to commit suicide, or at least be extremely unhappy unless you pay for this surgery, well, that's a vast money-making enterprise. I don't know how that's played out in Australia. Of course, the way Americans typically handle this is then, if there's a problem, detransitioners will go back and sue the doctors. And that's how the system tends to correct itself here. And I don't know how much that is happening. I'm sure some of that's happening now. But does the dynamic play out differently in Australia, closer to the UK, perhaps?
Australia tends to be a combination of the US and
That's
the UK.
true. Mm-hmm.
They even refer to our parliamentary system as a Washminster system. So we have the great blessing in Australia of understanding both British and American humour, and getting both cultures at least to a large extent. But we're somewhere in between, I think. But even in the UK, there've been court cases, and here there are some court cases in different states. Again, have different laws. The state of Queensland, where I was speaking last weekend, has just declared very helpfully that a woman is an adult human female, and this is whereas the Australian Sex Commissioner seems to have no idea what a woman is, and so we're still a little like the US in a place of flux and confusion, with different states at different places.
Yeah, let's go in a different direction here. I teach cultural apologetics, and when you're trying to trace cultural change, you have a lot of different options of being able to explain the causes behind the cultural change. None of them is necessarily wrong, but different people might put a different emphasis on some or the others. Rarely is it to the utter exclusion of the other. I'm wondering, Rob, do you lean more toward philosophical or technological arguments to account for the widespread adoption and plausibility of transgender theory?
That's a very astute question, because certainly none of this, or very little of this, could be happening without the technological and medical and surgical developments that we've seen. Now, clearly, if you think back to Deuteronomy 22:5 and the prohibition against cross-dressing there, the desire to cross-dress or to present as the other sex is clearly ancient, at least for some.
New.
No, that's not new. And historically, cases of what you might call, genuine gender dysphoria certainly are there in the historical record, and there have been people in great pain and distress about their sex for any number of reasons, and that's a whole thing we could get into too. What is it that leads people to a place of what you might call sex rejection, or where they're ashamed of their sex, wish they could be the other sex, or perhaps believe they are the other sexes. Anyway, lots of possible reasons that lead people to those places. But it really was only, midway through last century that serious surgical attempts started being made to transform, cosmetically at least, transform the bodies of men, particularly, into feminine form. And that's just gone on from here, and the surgical techniques have developed and, some might say improved, although, again, there's so much malpractice and so many disaster stories and so many unhappy patients out there. You wonder how much they've really improved. But we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here without the technological.
Well, I'm just thinking, Rob, even at a deeper level than the surgical technology and the hormonal treatments, is simply the Gnostic tendencies of the internet itself. The avatar dynamic of the internet, the way you can put on and take off identities at whim that are disconnected, present in ways that are disconnected from your biological reality.
Yeah. The internet is a very disembodying phenomenon, and one of the advice that those who seek to advise parents who are trying to help their trans-identified teens to find their way out of the maze is to get them off their devices, into their bodies, out into the world. Get them riding horses, climbing walls, get them playing a sport, get them playing a musical instrument, get them just walking out of their rooms, off their screens, because the effects of that on all minds, but certainly young developing minds, are profound, and so that is certainly part of the problem. And of course, the internet, in a sense, just comes in alongside what Carl Trueman has so helpfully pointed out for us all, just the whole the modern self and the expressive individualism that is just in the air we breathe, and so it just plays into that. But the other factor I should mention, because it does relate to one of the reasons people get drawn into this world, is for people who are neurodiverse or on the autism spectrum. Not only are they very much drawn to online life, and but also find it hard to relate to their own, not only their own social group, but their own body, and find the changes of adolescence particularly traumatic. Boys can find the development of growth of body hair very distressing for them, and girls likewise find the bodily changes of puberty distressing, and as you say, if they're familiar with the whole avatar phenomenon and being able to, as it were, reinvent themselves online, and here comes trans theory saying, well, the reason you're uncomfortable is because you're trans, and you just need a new avatar, and this is the way to do it. You start taking testosterone or whatever. It's this perfect storm.
Yeah, and I think evangelicals in our view of technology is often limited. And it's limited to the explicit messages. And so when we're talking about devices, we are on the one hand saying, yes, because a lot of the messages that they will receive there will be against our biblical beliefs. But at the same time, it's just the environment of becoming disconnected from reality, disconnected from biology. So it's not just what are you going to see or what are you going to hear, what are you going to learn, but those factors can be really significant as well. But it's just the fact that you're not present with your physical self. Let's just do. I mean, the book is we're talking about. The Body God Gives: A Biblical Response to Transgender Theory, written by Rob Smith. The book is so helpful because when people who are watching and listening to this, they pick up the book, they're going to see all this exploration of really significant philosophical argumentation that's important, but then they're going to pivot in the book toward a lot of biblical argumentation and then application in the end. So let's just start this and keep it simple, Rob. What's the most important? There are others, but what's the most important biblical argument against transgender theory?
Well, I do think the entirety of biblical sexual ethics is really built on the foundation of Genesis 1 and 2. And so when I came to writing the book, and before that, the PhD that lies behind it, I planned just to write a chapter on Genesis 1 and 2. I ended up writing 3 chapters and could have written more because there's so much there and so much to appreciate and understand of what's going on, what's being revealed. Now, I think what we learn from those 2 chapters together, not only are there only 2 sexes, male and female, that's right there in Genesis 1:27, but of course the male of Genesis 1 is the man of Genesis 2. The female of Genesis 1 is the woman of Genesis 2. So you have binary sex, and that then, it just sets the agenda that if you're born male, you become a man and become a husband, become a father if you marry and have children and so on. So those lines just follow straight through in Scripture, but they're all based on that fundamental foundation. But it does interest me that the first thing we're told about humanity, apart from the very first thing is that we're made in the image of God. But then when we come to verse 27 of Genesis 1, male and female made he them. Now they are biological terms, they're bodily terms, they're reproductive terms, in fact. So this is clearly very significant to what it is to be human. You can't be a non-sexed human. You are a male or a female human. There is no non-binary or agender or any of these claimed non-sexed terms. So that's significant. And then in Genesis 2, likewise, the Lord forms the body of the man even before he becomes a living being. So he's a man because of the body that he has. And of course, then the Lord builds the woman from the side of the man again, and she is embodied differently. She is in the Hebrew term, a connector, a like opposite. She's like him in humanity, but opposite him in sex. And all of that again relates to bodies. So the title, I suppose, of my book, which wasn't my doing, it was Lexham marketing people, "The Body God Gives," really is. It was a very clever choice of title because it answers the fundamental question: how do I know if God has made me to be a man or a woman? And the answer is the body God gives.
I think it's a great title, Rob, because it hints also at the essential biblical and philosophical problem underneath everything, which is the givenness of our bodies, the givenness of life, the givenness of things by a God who delights to give good things. The reason I had such an overwhelming reaction to what you describe as that transgender turn in 2013 and 2014 is that it felt like we were arguing at the deepest level about the most essential elements of reality. Is anything given in this world? Because if our bodies are not given, then what else is? Is there anything at the bottom of anything, or is everything just whatever we decide to make of it? And that is existentially crushing. Now, it seemed like a kind of game, and maybe that's some of the philosophical backstory that you give, that gaming, but it's one thing for a bunch of academics to talk about it and play with it in the 1990s. It's another thing for it to be enacted, and not only enacted at a legal level in Western culture, but also then enforced and mandated on everyone. That there is no givenness to anything in life, not even your body, not even in your earliest moments on this earth. So to go back to see at the essence of everything is a God who gives nothing short of life. It's a pretty good place to start.
It's a very good place to start. And and again, to circle back to where we were earlier, contrast with Foucault, who wants to say we only see things a certain way because of the cultural spectacles we've been given, and then Judith Butler will say, yes, we we think there are male and female bodies, but no, that's just, we're just imposing those categories on the bodies that are out there. There are just bodies, and we've imposed these categories. But then to have Scripture come along and say, no, here's divine revelation. There is male and female, and only male and female, and this is God's gift, and it's good. I think that's the other thing, perhaps to stress, because it's the goodness of sex, the goodness of embodiment, the goodness of being a man, the goodness of being a woman that is under attack in many ways. And I guess if I had one message for teenagers, it's to say, look, yes, adolescence is traumatic. Yes, puberty's a challenge, but it's actually good. It's part of God's design. It's how you move from being a child to an adult, and a girl to a woman, a boy to a man. It's good. Your body's good. What's happening to your body is good. It's good to be male. It's good to be female. It's not weak. It's not toxic. It's not, so, to teach these things, to teach the goodness of creation, as well as, of course, the way the fall complicates everything.
I'm going to ask you a question now, Rob, that you're uniquely gifted and trained to be able to answer. And I think you'll know where I'm going with this. Do you see any tension between the Old Testament's focus on marriage and family and the New Testament's focus on our spiritual brotherhood? Of course, this is a question very relevant to the dimensions of your book on transgender theory, but it's also relevant in the basic biblical theology. How do you piece the Bible together?
It is. I don't see tension, let alone conflict, but I do see a difference in emphasis. And part of that has to do with the way in which the particular calling of the people of Israel, and the way in which that nation was to grow, and therefore the calling to be fruitful and multiply had particular relevance, of course, to God's own people. And as far as we can tell, certainly remaining unmarried was very much an exception, even though, of course, being widowed was sadly par for the course for many. So there is, I think, a difference of emphasis, perhaps from kind of this worldly fulfillment of promises. The way in which the church grows, of course, is through disciple making, and which, of course, includes Christian parents having children and discipling their own children. But it's, of course, much bigger than that too. But there clearly is an emphasis in the New Testament, care of Jesus himself, I suppose, who is the quintessential, in Matthew 19 language, person who's made himself a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. But as Jesus says in that passage, this is not for everybody. But Paul likewise will see that there are advantages in remaining unmarried, but again, this is not for everybody. So I think there is, again, that shift in emphasis, but not in any way at the expense of, or in a way that devalues the family or marriage. It's it's impossible to read the New Testament and come away with a low view of marriage and family. But perhaps you come away from the New Testament with a higher view of singleness than perhaps the Old Testament would have left you with. So that may be the way I'd put it. There's no devaluing of the family, but there is a valuing of remaining unmarried for kingdom purposes for those to whom it is given.
I like that. Well, I just think if we're going to have a biblical response to transgender theory, which is what you're offering in this book, then we need a whole Bible hermeneutic that recognizes, as I was trained by our good friend Don Carson, and thinking about the continuities and discontinuities of scriptures, the things that change and the things that stay the same. And so we know that the Bible does not contradict itself because God does not contradict himself. And yet the ways he reveals himself and the priorities that he sets would do sometimes change throughout the scriptures. So that's often what I'm finding in these debates, which will come down to questions about natural law, the best ways to be able to argue about these matters. I appreciated a biblical theological approach that you brought to this book to be able to acknowledge that we can handle these questions on multiple angles. Not only the angles of the givenness of male and female, as we just covered in there, but also the reality of the spiritual family and the way that God knits together a very different kind of people who are united in Christ, male and female, slave and free, Jew and Greek, and on and on and on in there. So we're just going to need all of those arguments together to be able to respond effectively, not only intellectually, philosophically, but also just practically. So that's where I want to move next here. And the next two questions are practical outworking of this. And as you mentioned early in the interview, Rob, part of your motivation, what are the experiences within your own, broader family about this? But just start with the Christian who is him or herself experiencing gender dysphoria. Just not the whole thing. Just where do you start? Where do you start with that person? They're listening, they're watching, they're confused, they're hurting. Where do you start with them?
Well, I personally would want to start by listening to them and hearing their story. Mark Yarhouse, who has written a number of things in this space, who I disagree with on some things, but he has many helpful things to say. He says often when he meets someone, he says something like, I feel like I'm meeting you in chapter 5 of your story. Tell me about chapters 1 to 4. Yeah. And I think often that's just as a relational courtesy as well as a pastoral, a bit of pastoral wisdom that I think we need to try and understand the bigger picture for a person. Now, again, for some people, their gender dysphoria goes way back to childhood. But for others, it's come on in adolescence. And for some, even it's come on later in life. And now our job, I suppose, as pastors is not to be clinicians or psychologists, unless we had that sort of training. But still, we want to understand the whole person and work out how to bring the Word of God to bear on their lives. Listening is where to start for sure. But perhaps one of the key questions you can ask in the right way at the right time is what do you think is making you unhappy about being a boy or being a man or being a girl, being a woman? Essentially, what is the problem? And of course, the person may not know, but it may get them thinking. And that's why I said there are many roads in here, and there are some obvious ones like, sexual abuse or sexual trauma or sexual shaming or even just bullying, particularly sex-related bullying. For those who are gender non-conforming or again, neuroatypical or something. They're often parts of the picture. Again, they may have been exposed to some trans indoctrination and believe that all of their adolescent angst is because they're in the wrong body and that therefore transitioning would solve everything. Or they may have been looking at pornography. I mean, one of the things that Abigail Schreier first alerted me to this in her book, Irreversible Damage, that pornography is scrambling the brains of kids and their psychosexual development in terrible ways, absolutely terrible ways. And not just girls. I mean, girls are horrified by what they're seeing, but also boys are being made to feel completely inadequate and uncertain about. And so it's a scourge. The kids who've been exposed to that, and many are now getting exposed at 8 and 9, and there may be all kinds of kind of deprogramming they need to to unscramble their thinking. And
not to mention, Joe Carter pointed this out in an article years ago at the Gospel Coalition. He simply observed that the rise of LGBT identities corresponded to a widespread rise in pornographic viewing, and realizing that they were seeing sexual scenes depicted that are very different from what other people had predominantly been exposed to in the past, and especially in formative years, that normalized all sorts of different abnormal and immoral, of course, configurations there.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
all of that, like you said, scrambles the brain in ways that are, again, deeply, deeply destructive, but they're important as part of the explanation of what's happening overall. I just have a couple more questions here where there's more that we could talk about, and the book clearly covers a lot. The book is, again, The Body God Gives, a biblical response to transgender theory, written by Rob Smith. This is a hard and extremely sensitive question, Rob, but I think it wouldn't be fair to not consider it in light of the reality of what we're seeing. It's been a spate of acts of deadly violence, often deliberately aimed at Christians by people who identify as transgender. What do you make of that, if anything?
When I first started working in this area, my doctor, in fact, who's just a very wise man, very Christian man, he said to me, and he'd been involved, I think, in some early work with gays and lesbians. He said, "You realize what you're going to be stepping on people's identities here, and you will get some fairly savage reactions at certain points," and of course I have, although perhaps not very many, thankfully. But so yeah, when people feel that they're under threat and their identity is under threat, or perhaps the identity of their loved ones, or even a so-called community that they feel they need to protect, then they can come out very savagely. And again, if there are other issues of instability and things going on, then that can prove violent and catastrophic. So in one sense, any of us are capable of that under the right circumstances, but we obviously have seen in recent times a number of, you might say, trans-related. I mean, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, of course, was at least allegedly by a man in a relationship with a trans woman, or someone who was in the process of transitioning. So again, you've got an ally there, I suppose you might say, a trans ally rather than a trans person. But, well, God willing, we won't see more of this. But what we mustn't conclude, of course, is that everyone who even is a trans ally or themselves trans-identified has got, violent thoughts. But perhaps the deeper issue is that they may well be feeling greatly threatened, even if that's a false thought. And so we just need to be sensitive to that. So people use this sort of wild language of trans genocide and trans extermination and so on. And I've even had people say those sorts of things to me. You want to just erase all trans people, and sometimes you just can't reply at all. Shouldn't reply. Sometimes it's a pearls before swine moment, but other times you need to say, no, you're misunderstanding me. I'm wanting to help those who are finding it hard to be men and women to work out what that's about and realize that there is actually a better way, which has got to do with embracing the body God gives. Which may be a difficult task under their circumstances and may be a lifelong journey for them. But that is the way, as you quoted before from the book, going with the grain of creation. toward the goal of new creation, that's the path of healing and integration and flourishing.
You mentioned something about identity and identity being threatened. And when I've seen Tim Keller and others assess what is the issue beneath the issue beneath the issue, it is the existential weight of forming our identity ourselves. You alluded this earlier in Expressive Individualism with Carl Trueman. And so the expressive part also is the need for others to affirm it. And then our human need to be able to bring together a community around that. So whatever we might be encountering in the manifestations, the presentations of this dynamic, underneath everything is a lost identity, or a search for identity, and usually a search for identity apart from any reference to God. And I think that also makes a lot of sense of why so many adolescents are dealing with this, because is that not the time of life when you're most wrestling with a lot of those questions about identity? It can be a very scary, very overwhelming time for people there. And so, but it only makes the problem that much worse when we are cut off from the given biology, not to mention biblical answers, not to mention cultural, the grain of culture through history, not to mention the natural law revealed in a Romans 1 kind of sense of the reality of Genesis 1 and 2. So there's a lot going on, but underneath it is that basic problem of identity. Now, last question I have here, Rob, it could ask many others, but you've already been very generous with your time. What work do we still need from evangelicals about transgender theory?
That's a very good question. At the end of my book, I suggest the next place to go is more directly into the pastoral domain. But what more work is there to do still in the theological and exegetical domain? Now, there are still debates about particular passages. I've just been sent an article about arguing that, it sounds like a rather crazy argument to me, but it's in a serious theological journal arguing that that we don't know whether God will raise us male and female, or at least we don't necessarily. The argument, I think, of the paper is God might raise a man who feels he should be a woman as a woman. And if God might do that, then perhaps it does make it permissible to transition that man to living as a woman in this world. That kind of argument.
That's strange.
Now, so there's just a need for ongoing responses to some of these curious and challenging arguments. So there'll be further work needed along those lines. And so I'm torn here between the fact that I tried to dig into as many areas as I could in the book, and wasn't sort of immediately where I'd left big holes. But I also know that there's always more work to do. Hence your question's a good one. But I do think it's at the area of implementation, application, pastoral practice that certainly that's where I want to go next, and I'm working on a book already on that front. So yeah, look, this is not the right response for a podcast, but I want to take your question on notice and ponder it.
No, I think you did answer it. You said we need more practical work on how to work this out. I mean, there will be new challenges. There may be nuanced dimensions of the debate, and as it develops, just look at the last decade and how much has changed, the rise and fall of this theory.
Yeah.
But it when it rose, the foundations had already been laid, that it had happened decades ago, and as it falls, the underlying questions about identity formation in Western culture, those aren't going away. So those are going to be perennial challenges for us, and we're going to need to work on those.
Yeah, and there is certainly work to be done on questions of identity, and my friend Brian Rosner has written a couple of books on that front already, and as have others. I've got a piece I'm writing on the ethics of gender transitioning, or at least arguing that it's not an ethical path. The other area that I'm aware of, actually, now you've got me thinking. I'm glad that there's kind of been an evangelical recovery of natural law approaches, but I'm also slightly nervous that we are inadvertently kind of adopting almost a Catholic methodology rather than seeing the need for Scripture to reveal nature to us. So we can't go to nature directly, or at least, well, we can, but we don't know what we're reading without, to use Calvin's metaphor, putting on the glasses of the spectacles of Scripture. So we need Scripture to illuminate nature and creation, rather than thinking we can just read off creation unaided. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, that is a perennial question, and it's one that I'd asked you, that I alluded to earlier in the question of simply how do you put the Old Testament and the New Testament together. And a lot of that is not only valuable for the normative sense of how we teach our congregations, how we lead our congregations, but also in a situational sense. How do we argue for these issues? And of course, one of the things that we've seen in the gay marriage debates and now the trans debates would be the way that Catholics have adopted a lot of natural law theories as a way, especially to integrate within a judicial framework, to argue that these are not explicitly revelatory matters that depend on a particular set of scriptures, but in fact are known to all people. And that, of course, makes it easier to make the judicial argument. It also makes it easier to make the apologetic argument.
Yes.
But you still run into some basic challenges, such as, the explicit teachings of Jesus that call us to a certain kind of more radical discipleship than you might get from simply reading the grain of the culture and traditional societies. You also are prone potentially to run into a kind of cultural essentialism as it comes to masculinity and femininity, that this is the way that we are always meant to be without a recognition of its cultural conditioning there. So at least that's how I see some of the potential tensions emerging.
Yeah, no, that's a helpful comment. And certainly I think we want to be very affirming of creation order and see the value of these arguments and the persuasiveness of them. But just knowing that our epistemological certainty comes via scriptural confirmation rather than simply via our own empirical kind of observation. Yeah. So.
Well, in a good long interview, we've gotten a taste of what readers could hopefully get more of in The Body God Gives, a biblical response to transgender theory, written by my guest, Rob Smith. Just really, really encouraging endorsements on this book, and it lives up and rewards the careful attention that the reader gives to it. Rob, thanks for joining me on Gospel Bound.
Been a great pleasure, Colin.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Gospel Bound. For more interviews and to sign up for my newsletter, head over to tgc.org/gospelbound. Rate and review Gospel Bound on your favorite podcast platform so others can join the conversation. Until next time, remember, when we're bound to the gospel, we abound in hope.